From Isolation Studios, it's Richard Crouse.
Welcome, everybody, to In Isolation With. It's the talk show where we make a connection without actually making contact. I'm Richard Crouse. I hope that you're staying healthy, and I hope that you're staying happy. A little bit later, we'll meet Paul Perrier, a photographer who's creating a really cool art project on Instagram documenting how people have reacted to the pandemic. We'll get to that in just a little bit. First, let's meet Clarke Peters. He's been in so many things, but if you were a fan of The Wire, or if you went to the theater to see the Tony Award-nominated Five Guys Named Mo, you're very familiar with him. The busy actor, playwright, and director stars in the new Spike Lee film Da 5 Bloods as one of 4 Vietnam veterans who returned to the country decades later to recover the body of their former squad leader, played by Black Panther's Chadwick Boseman. Now, that body just happens to be situated near some secret treasure. It's an adventure movie that also examines the role of African American soldiers in Vietnam and how that conflict affected the rest of their lives. The American-born Clarke Peters has lived in London, England since the 1970s, and that's where we caught up with him. Here's Clarke Peters. You're at your home in London, I'm assuming. Are you in England right now?
Yes, I am.
And how are things going there? How are you feeling? Are you happy and safe and isolated and staying healthy?
Well, I have been isolated, yes. I am safe, yes, to a small degree. But the events of this last week seem to get through every barrier that one has up. You know, You can't help that from happening. Yeah, but thank you for asking.
Well, the events of the last week, I think, are very timely in terms of some of the themes that are presented in this film. And in one of them, I think that one of the messages here is that we have to learn to think more about the collective and not just the individual. And that is something that I think comes through loud and clear here in the film. I think it's an idea that is very potent. I also think that in the pandemic, we've started to think that way. The events of the last week, though, kind of make me think otherwise a little bit. What's your take?
Well, the pandemic, I think, was a wonderful prelude to people slowing down, stopping, and having a chance to reflect. Mm-hmm. I think the more recent events, those people who were reflecting were able to and empowered to get up and do something about it. They were not just venting their frustration for being locked up. I would imagine that they also came to a point of conscience like, well, that is wrong. I've had time to sit back and think about things, think about my life, think about my children's life, think about my neighborhood, think about these things in general. So in that respect, George has served us all, has done a great service to us all in that respect. Unfortunately, it has also shown that there are certain individuals that have no respect for life whatsoever. And sadly, they are sitting in seats of power. That and are finding ways to use that power abusively. Unconsciously and unconscionably as well. So I think the pandemic with this coming on has been a very, very interesting movements in history, for the whole of the Western world, really, or for the whole earth. The whole dynamic of the effects of colonialism are being played out now because of this. From the Maoris in their protest, to Japan and its protest, around Europe, you've seen that, and so there's something wonderful in one respect happening out of this senseless tragedy, out of senseless, absolutely senseless. You know, it's taken me a while to stop crying behind it. You know, but yeah, we will get beyond this. You know, what we need is a proper plan of what we're going to evolve into. There's no use of having a revolution if you don't know what you're going to evolve into.
You were 19 in 1971, living in Paris, doing hair, the play Hair, not doing hair, but doing the play Hair. And the FBI got in touch with you. And I love what you said about this. You said, if the enemy comes to America, I'll be there, but I don't know the Vietnamese. If you put me in the army, I'm not going there. Were those the most terrifying words that you've ever had to speak?
Pretty much so, because I didn't know exactly how it was going to be taken.
Mm-hmm.
You know, what I also said at that point in time was, I wasn't hiding.
Mm-hmm.
They tried to. I was charged with evading the draft, which means that you're hiding. I lived in Paris. I was at the embassy on a number of occasions. My mail came through American Express. When by that time '74, by that time I was in London, so and had lost a passport. You know, I mean, so it wasn't like I was hiding. You know, and I think that when they realized their bureaucratic mistake, there was nothing that they could do. But also at the same time, I think that the FBI officers that I was in front of were very sympathetic to my cause and understood what I don't think they were really wanted to go through that process for the day. It was just like, let's get this over and done with, because this is nonsense, you know. And I appreciate them for that, believe me.
How does it feel then, almost 50 years later, to revisit the idea of going to Vietnam for the film?
It feels I don't know. That's interesting. There's a certain cathartic kind of feeling about it because of the demon of it and the fear of it over here in the back of my mind. But being able to meet some vets who are still living in Vietnam, you know, having seen vets on the streets in New York, in Baltimore, in New Orleans, Los Angeles, I don't seem to carry the same anger and vehement that I had as a young man. You know, life has sort of softened softened the edges of my ire.
Right.
But I understand them now more. You know, and I don't look at them as the enemy. Some of them I look at as victims. Others I look at as heroes. You know, for me, they're all heroes. They are all heroes, because at the end of the day, we wouldn't have the freedoms that we have in the West without them. You know, and I realize that there's a portion of society that is raping the earth and using the military as their way in, you know. So I don't look at our military as being the bad guys. I see them more as being the victims, as being pawns in somebody else's greed.
Interesting to have a situation of being a soldier in Vietnam as an African-American person and supporting a country in a war that really isn't supporting you back in a lot of ways. And I think that's something that this movie also explores. There's so many tangential things in it. It's Treasure of the Sierra Madre. It's an adventure film. It's all that stuff. But there's some, like all Spike Lee films, they're like onions. The more layers that you pull, there's always another one underneath it.
Yes.
And
yes.
I think that was very interesting. And to create that mindset? Did you talk to soldiers who had been in Vietnam about that, some African-American soldiers?
Well, we had when we were going through our boot camp, and for a couple of weeks before that, we were working through the script, and we were meeting people, we were meeting vets who, like I say, who were living there, and having discussions with them, asking them questions, and to find out how we fit into their skin, and there was one. We never got into the politics of why you went over there, and why and all of that, because they stayed there. That spoke volumes. That spoke volumes that you stayed in Vietnam, right? For whatever reason, you did not want to go back to America. That spoke volumes. The other thing was that there was one man who was answering questions pretty much with ease until we asked him about, did you ever lose anybody who was close to you in Vietnam? And his whole demeanor changed. And there was like a pall of deep, deep sorrow that came over him that he couldn't easily shake off and finesse a way to continue the conversation. We all felt it. And there was a long pause before he said yes, and that was more telling than anything else he told us about the war. That also fed into our understanding of the love and the loss that men and women in that situation experience, but more particularly those of African descent. That bond and that love was something that came out of the 60s and throughout the 70s and 80s in the African American community. It was dismantled. And I think it was dismantled purposely, because what we do realize is that love really will conquer all. And if you have a group of people who love each other, they protect each other, they nurture each other, and together they grow. So the best thing for you to do if you want to control them is certainly divide and conquer, and make sure you find a way to cause some enmity between them.
You've worked with Spike Lee before in 2012, Red Hook Summer. You played Bishop Enoch. It's a much different kind of film. Has his style of directing changed from in those 8 years? Was there a difference? Because, I mean, there are action scenes in this film. It's a much different, the making of it must have felt a little different.
It was just a different experience that I had with him. That's all. And that was the only time. I think that question should be asked to Delroy and to Isaiah, because they've worked with him more often than I did. The thing that remained the same was that his work ethic, which is let's get up, let's get it done. This is a story that needs to be told. Let's get cracking. I love that. And what he allows us to do is to add colors to his palette, and he presents a palette that is just a wonderful array of things to draw from. That hasn't changed, but I've seen directors not really know how to manage a set. With all the components that he had to deal with, I think he did dynamically well. Mm-hmm. The language, the environment, the different cultures, when we were on the canal, that's a whole nother thing to have to deal with. Yeah. We're not in the jungle now. We're someplace up. So there are a lot of elements. From how do you shoot in a paddy field? How do you shoot in a bamboo forest? How do you shoot up these mountains? How do I get this crew over here? There was a lot going on, and I would say he had a great team around him. Every single one of them was a star, but he was the boss. He was the boss, Yeah.
You have two moments in the film that I think tell us everything we need to know about your character Otis without saying a word. and I love both these moments. And I, I don't know if they're the ones that resonated with you, but for me as a viewer, they did. When you first meet a young woman, I don't want to give anything away. You first meet a young woman at a dinner table. The look on your face tells you everything we need to know about your character's compassion, his empathy, his sense of loss, perhaps. There's a lot going on right here. And then early on, and this doesn't give anything away, there's a scene with some firecrackers and everyone just plummets to the ground, just they think it's gunshots. And that suggested to me that the experiences of 4 decades or more ago are still right here, still
Yeah.
top of mind. And those
Yeah.
two scenes told me everything I need to know about Otis, and you don't say a word in either. Well, eventually you do, but you don't say a word in both those moments that I love so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Yes, that's yeah. That former one that you're talking about was all I had to do is think about it.
Yeah.
You know, all I had to do is think about being in that situation. You know, and that's what I mean about Spike.
Right.
You just go there. You know, I could have improvised some lines or something like that there, but you know, that was part of his palette as well. You know, indeed.
You just finished the American Clock at the Old Vic, doing the American Clock at the Old Vic. Then the pandemic happens, everything is shut down, and I'm hearing that the Old Vic, they've got some plays that they're doing online and things like that. But is there news? Will they reopen? Because the word that I've heard over here is that they may not, and that would just be heartbreaking.
Well, it would be heartbreaking for all of us. You know, we're theater actors first. You know, we do film because we like theater, and it doesn't really pay, but that's where our hearts are at. We don't know what's going to happen with the West End. We don't know what's going to happen with Broadway. You know, which brings to mind, you know, there's another strand to this pandemic that is not being seen. And because it's not being seen, it's not just my antennas that are going up. Right. There are a lot of people's antennas that are going up like, wait a minute. There's too much disinformation and distraction for a society with this much intelligence to not be able to come up with one scenario that works. So, because there's something different coming out of China, something different coming out of Italy, something different coming out of New Zealand, something else different again coming from England, something different coming from 5 different places in America, it makes me wonder. But I suspect that amidst all that, you know, that theaters will be locked down for a long time. But they might also be the first places that open up again to allow groups of people to come together and have the collective experiences that theaters give people.
I always believe that there is no better way to create community and empathy than putting a group of people, group of strangers facing this way and have another group of them facing this way that are telling us a story.
That's right. And for us as well, you know, for those actors who understand the magic of it, we also understand that there's a great responsibility in it. It is not about your ego. You are not the star. It's the story that you're telling that's the star, and you tell that story as best as you can, you know. And through the years, you find ways to hone your craft so that you can, you know, that if I hold on for just 2 seconds longer before saying this next word, that a tear is going to come up in somebody's eyes over there, or that the whole audience is going to fall out in laughter. That's a hell of a power to have and a hell of a responsibility, but also a very necessary service for society in the situation that we're in now.
I couldn't agree more. Thank you so much for this. What a pleasure to speak to you.
And to you, Rob.
And congratulations on the film. And I hope to see you on stage sooner rather than later.
From your mouth to God's ears, baby.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye for now.
Watch Clarke Peters in The Five Bloods, streaming on Netflix from June 12th. Now let's meet Paul Perrier, photographer and documentary filmmaker. As many of us sheltered in place at the beginning of the pandemic, Paul did what artists do. He grabbed his camera and hit the streets, taking photographs of people and their masks. The result is the Toronto Portrait Project, a series of photographs that document the face, or I guess the faces, of the pandemic. Here's Paul Perrier to explain more.
It's been a weird time for everybody, but for a photographer, it's kind of been like a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to document what I consider to be a really historic period of time, in Toronto for sure, but around the world.
What are you seeing on the streets?
Well, it's changed. So I think I shot the first portrait on March 19th. And that was just around when the lockdown started, I think, within a couple of days. And it was really, it was like being on a movie scene almost. Like the streets were quiet. I was riding the subways, they're empty. People were, I've noticed in the portraits myself that it started off a lot more clinical, the masks, right? Like people were using those clinical masks, and now it's become a bit, over about a month and a half, it's become a bit more of a fashion thing.
Right.
Which is interesting. So, and more people are wearing masks now than from when I started.
Right.
And social distancing, it's like what I have to do to get these, I have to approach people to ask them if I can photograph them, because I've asked people to pose for these. I'm not just shooting random people.
And what's the response? How do you do it? Because you have to stand, I guess, 6 feet away from someone and kind of like, hey, give them a heads up first. So what's the response?
So my process is I go out and, I'll go to an area, and if I see somebody with a mask, I don't ask everybody. I look at people's eyes. I can usually tell if the people that I approach are going to do it or not just by seeing their eyes.
Right.
If they make eye contact with me, a lot of people have their heads down in their phones. They have their earphones in. So, a lot of people don't pose. But I stop people and I say, excuse me, I'm 6 feet away from them. I have my phone in my hand that has some sample pictures of it. And I just say, I'm shooting this series of portraits. Would you like to participate? And I'll give you a picture.
And what do you see coming out of all this? Because the picture that you took of me, I think, was number 543, if I remember. So you've taken hundreds of these things. And what is it? Like, is it just a portrait of a time now? Or how do you see this project kind of playing itself out?
Well, the photographs that I post on Instagram, and the site's called the Toronto Portrait Project. And I started it last summer, I shot a series of portraits using a fake wall background that I took and duct taped up to different walls and asked people to pose for photographs. I like going out on the street, and it's a way to connect to people. And it's as a photographer, it's almost like fishing. My dad used to brook trout fish. And I see a lot of similarities in it, that you go to a spot, there's a bunch of fish going by, you put out you cast out, and you'll reel in a few, but a lot go by also. But that's just, it's part of it. Photography is an isolated art form too, right? Like it's you and the camera. You don't need other people. You don't even have to go photograph people. I like photographing people, but I also, during this time, have also been photographing the city empty. Like I shot a photograph on shooting near Dundas Square, shooting north on Yonge Street, and there's no cars in it. and there's no people.
Wow.
And I shot it on, I think it was Easter Sunday afternoon.
Wow. That's like one of those pictures you see of Toronto from 1968, you know, when there's just nobody. There's just nobody on the streets on a Sunday. Wow.
It's fascinating. And you know, the other thing I've noticed is the light. Like, the pollution is less. It's beautiful out. You don't have as much smog, and there's a whole bunch of combinations to make beautiful photographs.
They're on Instagram, and it's called the Toronto Portrait Project on Instagram. You can find it on Twitter as well, and that sort of thing, I'm sure. And what are people saying? What are kind of the comments that you're getting from the photographs?
It's fascinating. You know, the people who do participate really love it, because they get a really interesting souvenir from a pretty dark time. I think it makes people happy. Like, I'm doing it because I'm interested in it, but I also like giving people something during this time to make them feel good.
Yeah.
And I've had some really, some people, it's just, I'll be with them, I'll stop them, I usually take maybe 3 or 4 photographs. It's very quick. But some people, we hang around and have these pretty intense conversations. And, it's fascinating. And a whole bunch of different responses. And a lot of people just scared when I approach them.
Yeah.
A lot of people think I'm trying to sell them something.
Right.
So there's a whole bunch. And a lot, like I said before, there's also people have their heads in their phones, and they don't want to stop or talk, or they're scared. There's a lot of fright out there.
Yeah, I mean, I have noticed, certainly, since everyone's been wearing masks, and as you say, that was a process. That was a gradual process. But, you know, the other day in the grocery store, I gave leeway to a young woman who was coming towards me, as, you know, gave her the 6 feet to walk past. And I smiled, and I think she smiled back, but it's hard to tell because, you know, her face was covered up to here. And so it does make that kind of social interaction a little bit more awkward, because it's hard to tell exactly what the person is saying with their face.
Yeah, although, the interesting part about that too is the eyes tell a lot, right?
Yeah.
Like you if you look at the photographs, my portraits in that whole series, and I think I've shot since March. I shot the first one on March 19th. I think I've shot 135 portraits.
Right.
But you can tell the people that are scared and the people who are, you can see the people that are happy or enjoying it too, because the eyes are the
window to the soul. That was Paul Perrier. Find his photographs on Instagram at the Toronto Portrait. My thanks to Paul and to Clarke Peters for taking the time to share their stories with us. Most of all, though, my thanks to you for watching. I'm Richard Crouse. Stay safe, stay happy, and we'll talk again soon.